This is a piece of a talk that I gave to a group related to what their role ought to be in terms of Christian case making as parents. Now, I think before I show this, let me just preface this. Would you agree that for the most part we've kind of delegated our responsibility as parents in one way or another, and we often do that. We often delegate our responsibility to others in a number of ways. Let's face it, a couple hundred years ago, if you were in our country in its early years, and you were probably your kid's teacher before we were using public schools. You were probably your kids a lot of things, and you would not relegate to somebody else. You would have taken responsibility for this. If nothing else, if you weren't your kid's teacher in those days, there would have been one teacher that the community might have hired that you'd have a much more engagement with, much more involvement with, to know in the small classroom setting what was being taught in that classroom. I think what we've done is we've kind of shipped off that responsibility to others. And for a lot of us who, I actually started homeschooling with my wife a number of years ago, not because I was concerned about what was being taught in the public schools. As a matter of fact, my wife and I are both graduates of public school system. Neither one of us, both of us were in the public school systems. We didn't go to private schools or theistic schools of one nature or another. Instead, we were just in the common public school, and we actually had a great experience. Now, that wasn't why we decided to homeschool. We decided to homeschool because we felt like, wow, it was like the kind of another expression of our parenting responsibilities. And we didn't want to delegate. So before long, we were homeschooling and even home churching. Because just as often as people are willing to delegate the education related to mathematics to somebody else, you know that we're also likely to delegate an education about God to somebody else. Not unusual for us to delegate these things to others. And that is really a challenge that you and I have to face up to. Are we doing enough as parents in this area of spiritual formation? Or do we really kind of think, well, no, that's our youth pastor's job. That's what, after all, why I came to this church. They've got a great youth program. I'm not responsible for that. I think that the church is responsible for that. Really? Okay, well, that might be the reason why we're in this dilemma to begin with. And to illustrate the relationship between the amount of time that you pour into this adventure of raising up your kids in their spiritual maturity and the kind of impact you can have, I have a part of my talk that I give on this very topic, in which I just kind of charted out on a graph to help people get it, to help people see it. And I'm going to play that because it's only about 4 minutes, and it's from a recent talk I did in front of a big church. So I want to play that. Although the video may not be the most high definition video, I think it illustrates the point better than I can. And I think also some of the visual aids that I have in my talk are in this video. So let's take a look at this. Then we'll take a quick break after that, and then I'll come back and add more to the discussion. Now, before I close with you guys today, I want to show you what your role would be in this. Because it turns out you might think, well, what's the church doing about this? That's something the church needs to do. No, it's not. And I realized it working gangs. We have a program in our city called DARE. Okay, and we would have these students who would come in the 5th grade, and we would teach them for, I think, 10 weeks, 16 weeks, whatever it is, an entire semester, to avoid drugs and alcohol. We don't do it anymore. We've stopped. Because we realized after graduating the first senior class years ago, and then the next senior class years after that we are not having any impact on drug and alcohol use. This program, there is no statistical difference in our city between those who have been through the program and those who have not. So we stopped doing it. We don't do it anymore. I realized something similar working in gangs. I was working in gangs for 2 years, and I used to go out to community events where parents would get in a large room and they would say to me, Jim, what are you guys doing? And by the way, I had young kids, so I was worried about my own kids. And the parents would say, what are you guys doing to keep our kids out of gangs? And I would tell them, nothing. That's not our job, is to keep your kids out of gangs. Our job is to keep your gangster kids from hurting the other kids. That's the job of law enforcement. I can't raise your kids. And it turns out that is the direct thing I want to leave you with today. There's a relationship between how long we train and how long we model and what kind of impact we can have. So if you asked me to come in and do a presentation as a speaker in your youth group, I can have a little bit of impact, but not a lot, but some. If you asked me to come in and do a series of talks, I could have more impact. If your pastor decides that they're just going to take on apologetics and Christian case making 24/7, that's going to have an even bigger impact on your students. But I'll be honest with you. If you want the biggest impact on your students, parents, we have to take on this job. We have to become good case makers for our kids, because if we do this, we'll have exponential impact. Exponential impact. Does that make sense? I want to call you to start having that kind of impact on your kids, because we have to make a change. We can have that impact, because Scripture tells us we have got to be training our kids. Now, I'm going to leave you with a way to get trained, to start getting trained, because we're called to train our kids. But I'm going to tell you right now that it's not going to be easy, but it's so important. You have to do it. And I'll leave you with free materials in order to make that case. At this website, I've got a hidden page. It's right here at coldcasechristianity.com/resources. Just type that into your browser, and I will send you everything we talked about today and a strategy to start training yourself. We're about to enter into a time of communion. And as a church, this is a time when believers celebrate what Christ has done for us on the cross. It's also a time when we can start to think deeply about our relationship with God. Because communion, Lord's Supper, is an act of worship. Would you agree? And when we sing, it's an act of worship. We sing to worship God with our voices, with our hearts. Do you realize, folks, that when we study and prepare to make a defense for what we believe, we are worshiping God with our mind?
Connect with Cold Case Christianity on social media. Visit the Cold Case Christianity homepage and click the social media icons on the top right toolbar. Jim is active on Facebook and Twitter, posting the best apologetics articles from over 250 Christian blogs around the country. You'll also find links to Jim's Instagram, Pinterest, and Google Plus accounts, along with the link to the Cold Case Christianity YouTube page. Stay connected with Cold Case Christianity and become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, so there you have it in the shortest form I think possible, in terms of just making a brief case for why you and I need to get involved in the lives of our kids and train them in this area. I mean, I think our culture has a tendency to move toward delegating the authority of raising children to the culture, to the government, to the system in place, to the public systems that do education. And this is why you see things like the DARE programs and other programs like GREAT, which is a GREAT, which is a training program that's similar to DARE, that's really about keeping kids out of gangs. Look, these are all efforts on a community level by public service organizations of one nature or another that are trying to do what in essence we ought to be doing as parents. Our responsibility as parents is to raise our kids with these values. And we have the best opportunity to do it because we have the most repeated contact with our young people. So that's why in the end we have to take on that responsibility. And we also have to take on the responsibility of training up our students, training up our young people in what they believe as Christians about spiritual formation. So I want to give you 4 ways to strengthen your kids' faith real briefly here in this final segment. The first is we have to become the source for answers. You and I as parents have to become the source for answers. As I said in the story about the lady who came to me to get a book signed, we have to be the first apologist, the first Christian case maker our kids will ever encounter. That means that in essence, there's a need for us to do what it used to be only a small percentage of the church was willing to do. There's always some percentage of the church that was interested in making a case and the evidence. And in some ways, this group that liked apologetics has been viewed kind of as the odd little percentage, 10% of the church. Well, look, that's got to change. If there's ever been a thing that ought to motivate the church to get involved and study apologetics, it ought to be the plight of young people who are being pulled away from the truth by a very convenient and well-voiced public lie, which is secularism. So we're going to have to do some work, I think, to become the best case makers we can be. In other words, you and I have to read the books before we'd ever tell our students to read the books. We need to be able to give the short version of the long answers for our students, and then we can point them to the long answer in a book. But you can't do that if you don't know what's in the book to begin with. So we're going to have to spend some time studying apologetics, studying Christian case making. What are the evidence for the Christian worldview? Also, number two, we're going to have to be willing to talk about the issues. And that means that there's stuff that we need to get engaged in. And sometimes it's a matter of waiting for the opportunity as a parent, because your student maybe for the first time is going to talk about a challenge that they faced with their teacher at school, or with their friend at school, or something they watched on television or watched on YouTube. Sometimes it's about waiting for that, but a lot of times it's about taking advantage of just times together. Like, there's a reason why family meals are so important, right? They're opportunities for us to bond with our families, but also opportunities for us to bond by way of conversation. And we get to decide oftentimes what those conversations are. I'm not suggesting that we're now going to become the driest, Christian case makers at every meal, where your kids are going to be going, oh my gosh, here we go again. No, every one of us as a parent knows how our students are wired, how our kids are wired. We have to take advantage of our wiring and their wiring in order to make connections on these key things. We're going to be talking about something. We might as well be talking about what we believe. Number three, we have to find for our students. We have to become like mentor finders. You got to find relevant mentors. Look, I've said this before, I don't know how recently on this broadcast, but when I was a youth pastor, I was an older youth pastor. I was in my 40s. And I really felt like, wow, in my 40s, am I going to be able to connect with young people in the way I'd like? Maybe not. Maybe I need to find somebody who's closer to their age. The first hire I made as a youth pastor were two young people in their very early 20s who held my worldview and held my desire to communicate the importance of evidence to my kids, my students, but they were much younger than me, and they were much cooler than me. And I connected my own kids, my own sons and daughters, to these mentors, because they basically were speaking the worldview that I held, but they were doing it as a much cooler, hipper version than me. And that's going to be important for you too. We have to be able to connect our sons and daughters to the relevant role models that hold our worldview but have a better connection. And that means that I do think is where a youth pastor can play a great role. I don't count on my youth pastor to be the source of all the information, 100%, but I do want the help of a youth pastor to model for my own kids what this looks like at the age of 25, at the age of 30, at the age of 35. I'm now in my 50s. I can model that, but I can't model the younger years. So we have to find relevant role models. Last thing, we got to provide transformational experiences. And I'm going to talk about that next week again. I've talked about it in the past here as well, but I'll talk about it even more robustly next week. We have to provide transformational experiences that put our teaching into practice. Those things, becoming a source for answer, talking about the issues, finding relevant mentors, and giving our kids a chance to have transformative experiences, which I'll talk about next week. That's about how we get on the battlefield to turn teaching into training. We'll talk about that more next week. And I hope you'll join us next week right here at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.